Hi, this is O'Connor, and thank you for joining this module, and I think it's module 9, Beyond Rhetoric, Management Accounting, Environmental Management Accounting. And what we mean by beyond rhetoric is that we're not just talking about greenwashing or disclosing stuff. We're talking about getting information so we can make better decisions, so we can take better actions, do better innovations in order to decrease our sustainability or environmental footprint. Okay, so let's get into some of the challenges of traditional financial accounting and how management accounting allows us to look at the numbers from a different perspective and how we can actually classify the numbers differently, accounting numbers differently, so then we can inform and make better economic decisions for the benefit of the company's environmental footprint. So that's what we're about today. Let's get into it. All right, so I'm going to cover environmental management accounting defined, the problem with conventional accounting, some practical solutions, techniques for and benefits of environmental management accounting accounting tools for investment appraisal and performance management, and two examples of environmental management accounting. If we have time, and we may do that in a separate video. All right, so we tend to think of accountants as financial professionals, as only involved in the capture and use of financial data, basic transactions that the company has, around direct and indirect costs and revenues that flow from operations. Yet there's also a lot of environmental costs and impacts that need to be captured and utilised in decision making. So environmental management accounting has been defined as follows. And that is the management of environmental and economic performance via management accounting systems and practices that focus on both physical information on the flow of energy, water, materials, and waste, as well as monetary information on related costs, earnings, and savings. Big mouthful there, but we're really focusing on and are more sensitive to specific aspects of the environmental costs. Environmental data can be used to increase the efficiency of an organization, both from a financial and environmental perspective. So, one of the first steps required when implementing an environmental management accounting system is to define which environmental costs will be accounted for. So we could actually organize or categorize environmental costs in terms of prevention, appraisal, internal failure, and external failure. Now, we've seen this categorization before when it comes to quality management, quality control in the factory, where we look at prevention of quality problems. We look at inspection of quality. Then we actually test products before they're sent to the customer. And if they fail, then we actually rework them or put them down as a reject so the customer doesn't get them and complain, which would be an external failure cost. And then the customer might sue you for a bad, faulty product. So the same type of classification can be given for environmental costs. Prevention costs associated with preventing adverse impacts on the environment. Appraisal costs associated with assessing compliance with policies related to environmental performance. Internal failure costs associated with eliminating environmental impacts caused by the organisation, and external failure costs associated with environmental damage caused outside the organisation. So the costs to be accounted for are often restricted to those currently recognised by an organisation pursuant to conventional accounting practices. So prevention costs is, the actual hiring of someone to go and inspect and monitor the operations of the organisation with respect to its impact on the environment. Okay, hiring people to actually collect more data on the firm's pollution, their waste, and other items associated with its environmental impact. Appraisal costs can be associated with assessing compliance with policies related to environmental performance. So and a lot of the compliance with policies coming from the GHG and the other bodies that we mentioned in earlier modules. And so because we have to disclose Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3, now we need to go and assess and measure these initiatives that we are undertaking. So prevention and appraisal, prevention is about stopping things from getting worse. All right, prevention is about let's do good right from the start, whereas appraisal is more monitoring and monitoring, observing, and collecting data on what is actually happening. So then when we collect all that data, we can better report what we are doing. All right, so that's the difference between prevention and appraisal. But when we look at internal failure and external failure could be, we might find that we're manufacturing a new item, but we find that there's dripping residue coming out of a particular process in the assembly. And we might see that if that residue is cleaned away and dripped off and goes into the waterway, then that's a major failure, a major pollution breach. But an internal failure cost is where we find it before it creates a catastrophic external failure, that is a pollution breach, and then someone comes along and then fines you for polluting the waterways. Okay, all right. So there's lots of examples out there that we can refer to. Yet these costs should be extended to include externalities such as pollution, just as I was talking about where possible. So there are two ideas I want you to take away first of all, and that's the problem with conventional accounting. Problem number one is poor measurement. And what do we mean by that? Well, typically accounting is going to be measuring monetary transactions, okay? The monetary transactions associated with corporate activities. When we buy and sell stuff, we transact, we get money, we sell the product. And so that becomes a monetary unit. It adds to the revenue, and then you've got costs taken off that, then you've got your profit, and then we report our profit and loss, we've got our balance sheet. Great, so that's the monetary, that's the MEMA. It's monetary environmental management accounting is when we put anything to do with what we're doing in the environment into monetary aspects, so we can report, we can disclose. That's great. But monetary does not mean control, and that's the big point I want to make here. If we're just measuring the monetary aspects of our environmental footprint, it does not necessarily allow us to make a better decision with regard to how can we reduce that environmental footprint. All right, the monetary is just a representation of transactions. It's a representation of the cost of some environmental initiative. All right, it doesn't help you make a better decision. What does help you make a better decision is if you focus on the physical environmental management accounting, and that refers to the company's impact on the natural environment. That is, we start measuring kilograms, cubic meters, or joules. So we start measuring kilograms of material per customer served, joules of energy. We start measuring kilowatt hours of electricity. We start measuring tons of water used each week, each month, each year. And let's see if we can reduce that amount of water in the following year. You see, once you start measuring the actual physical resources associated with the environment, then you're in a better position to think about how you can better control your environmental footprint or your environmental costs. Because control, it starts with the physical resources, not with the monetary value. So the PEMA is assessing different solutions, that's what we got here, all right, and to reduce pollution and increase efficiency. Whereas MEMA is to get management's attention. All right, so you've got to have both. You know, for the last 5 minutes, I'm saying, well, you've got to focus on the physical, but you also need to focus on the monetary, because if you don't focus on the monetary, which converts the physical into monetary, then it's a bit hard to convince the board of directors, we need to buy a new scraper to actually clean up our waste coming out of our factory so it doesn't run off into the waterway. Can we buy one next week? And the board of directors, first of all, they're going to think, okay, that's a great idea, but what are the costs and benefits? They want to know that if you're going to invest $200,000 in this machine, all right, what is the payback in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years time? You see, so they want to know the monetary aspect of some physical initiative. And so that's why MEMA is very important. MEMA is about getting management's attention so then they can give you the money to actually do the PEMA. The PEMA is where you get out and actually change actions, where you change ordering decisions, where you change the way you assemble items so you can reduce your environmental footprint. So MEMA and PEMA, both very important. The key difference, and this summarises it, is the type of measurement used and the information resulted, namely financial and non-financial measures and information respectively. All right, and summarising again, MEMA is about the impact, about the environment on the firm's financial performance, and PEMA is about the direct effects on the environment. Now, you can't have one without the other, all right? You need MEMA to get money from senior management. You need PEMA because that's where the action happens. All right, so number 2 problem of conventional accounting is poor classification. So what do we mean by that? Okay, let's have a look. Conventional management accounting mostly neglects separate identification, classification, measurement and reporting of environmental information, especially environmental costs. Therefore, most corporates do not incorporate their environmental costs into decision making. Environmental costs constituent all costs regarding environmental damage and protection. So basically, if we want to understand poor classification, we need to understand what are the cost objects that we are attaching those costs to. Typically, we put environmental costs into a big basket and we call it overhead. We don't necessarily relate environmental costs with the actual manufacturing of a product. And so we put the costs of cleaning up around the factory so there's no runoff into the river or into the waterways. We put the cost of planting trees. We don't really associate that with the manufacture of a product that's going on inside the building. But we need to do this in order to get much more finite attention on the decisions we are making on the manufacturing operations. And so typically environmental costs are accumulated as overhead, but we need to think of more creative ways to better allocate environmental costs to the value creating activities in the organization. And the value creating activities are the making of products, the providing of services. And if we can attach environmental costs to these value creating activities, then that will, number one, make environmental costs more important, all right, because it informs the decision about whether we make product A, B, and C more accurately, all right. And number 2, it just makes it more imperative that we don't just manage the product costs to be lower and lower and lower because customers are forcing us to sell it for lower and lower and lower, because environmental costs are now being attached to those products. Now it forces us to think of creative and innovative ways of how to better manage the environmental costs. All right. But in the past, environmental costs are in a separate bucket. They're just there. We have to disclose it. We have to do this, so we can't control it. But the minute we start attaching it to the product, then we have much more attention and a much more control over those environmental costs. And this is how we make an organization more sustainable over time, by actually focusing on all of the costs in the organization. And if we want to have a better focus, then we need to have a better classification. So that's why the second problem of conventional accounting is poor classification. Let's just have a look at this in a little bit more detail. So for example, environmental costs and expenditures have been classified according to the following environmental cost categories. There's waste disposal, emission treatment, costs to conventionally treat, dispose and clean up extant waste and emissions. There's prevention and environmental management, annual costs incurred for preventing waste and emissions. Environmental revenues, that's environmental revenues drawn from sales of waste or grants of subsidies. A key environmental cost for most organizations is waste. So we need to separate out what type of waste and classify that better, but also we need to attach that to our activities, our value creating activities. So this is an example of how we can actually separate out different elements of environmental costs. The use of energy, water and materials, generation of waste and emissions is directly related to many of the effects organizations have on the environment. So you've got to understand that the organization doesn't just produce waste. The organization makes products, provides services, and then in the process of these value creating activities, it creates waste. All right. So a byproduct of making the product is waste. So the actual creating products is also creating waste. And so this is how you see the connection. And this is why we need to better classify and reconnect waste with the operations and activities, the value creating activities of the organization. We could also include product design in there as well. What do we mean by that? Well, if we design a better product, that may reduce the extent of activities we undertake, and then that can actually reduce the waste that we produce. Wow, all connected. Everything is connected. So the problem with allocation of overhead, again, this is the poor allocation problem. Remember, in the past, we just had the poor classification, and that is really, rather than putting environmental costs into one overhead bucket, we actually separate out and we actually classify and call out different types of environmental costs. All right, the problem number 3 is poor allocation. The poor allocation of overheads to products to help. And when we don't allocate the environmental costs properly, then we don't make as good operation decisions and we don't make as good product design decisions. Where a variety of costs are accumulated in overhead accounts, the latter allocation of these accumulated costs to particular products or other cost centers are made according to simple metrics such as sales volume, output, or floor space. This might be an inaccurate way to allocate some environmental costs. For example, hazardous waste disposal costs might be allocated evenly across different product lines, even though most of these costs may stem from one product in particular. And so we need to have a more accurate allocation, because it may be product C that is creating more waste than product A and B. So it doesn't make sense to just divide the waste cost by 3 and split it across 3 products. We want to directly allocate or work out the cause and effect of that waste and associate that with a particular product. Because in the end, we might decide strategically, let's drop product C because the environmental footprint of this organization is just too large, and let's just continue with product A and B. Or alternatively, it may get us to think, product C is actually creating a lot of waste. How about we invest some money and try and redesign that product so in the process of making it, we don't incur as much waste. Wow. Okay, all right. So what else can we learn? As a summary of just what I said, this would distort the product pricing and profitability analysis. All right, other problems. Problem 4, and that is poor systems thinking. What do we mean here? All right, poor systems thinking is poor understanding of the cause and effect, that A causes B, causes C, causes D. And systems thinking is around us altogether. Like if you get up 5 minutes earlier, it's likely you might get an earlier bus. It may be that's connected to a train that is earlier, and it may be you get to work 10 minutes earlier than if you get up 5 minutes later, and then that causes you to be half an hour later. And that's interesting, because that's a system. You're going from A to B to C to D. So in the organization, the system is all about the flow of resources in the organization. And when you can think of a system as a pull system, that is, a customer buys a product, so therefore we need to ship more inventory, so therefore it causes us to put in a production order, and then we need to order material. So that's like a pull, cause and effect through the organization. But generally, the message of systems thinking is that everything is connected. You cannot say, we've got this environmental cost, but it's got nothing to do with our product manufacturing. It's got nothing to do with the sales service division of the organization. It's all connected. And so systems thinking is really not a DNA of typical accounting calculations. So let's have a look at what we can do here. Recognizing and dealing with externalities, like pollution from a factory damaging the air. Obviously, that pollution is going to be coming from the operations in the factory of making a product. So there's that system there. Recognizing that dealing with future environmental costs, lost customers, sales due to poor reputation in environmental management. Again, that may not be an actual operations system, but in some ways it's part of the social system. The fact that you are neglecting your environmental footprint or your polluting the atmosphere may cause your employees to leave the organization because they're just not comfortable with your strategic vision and priorities for the environment. Or it may cause customers to not buy your product because they don't see that your ranking on the CDC ranking, like last week or week before, modules, they don't see your ranking as very high compared to another brand, and they'll go and buy that brand instead. So, there's a connected system there, and it's a social system. It's the system of norms and values and expectations of the community that work in your factory, of the community that buys your products and services. So systems thinking is both physical and also social. And if you think of those two aspects, everything in society is connected. And this is something that accounting does a very poor job at. So often we're trying to measure value of many costs related to the environment here. All right, so there's our 4 problems. And now we want to think in terms of the solutions.